Welcome to Module 21. In this module, as we have now gone through the whole Tanakh, as we've gone through the New Testament, as we've looked at the life of Jesus and the theological concepts connected to who Jesus was, particularly from a biblical perspective, this module, what we're going to be looking at, is some of the theological concepts, so the key themes that run through the New Testament. Now, I want you to understand very clearly that these themes, which are a part of the New Testament, are not just New Testament themes, but they connect to the Old Testament realities as well. They connect to Old Testament perspectives and understandings as well. And so what we need to do is to make sure that when we look at the New Testament theme, that we don't look at it and say, well, how can I now justify this backwards? But rather by saying, how does this fulfill the concepts and the perspectives? How does this enhance the things that are part of the Tanakh and the way in which the Tanakh actually thinks of them? So I'm also not going to get heavily into the theological or the doctrinal perspectives of these key themes. Some of them are doctrinal. Some of them are things which will be different depending on which denominational group you come from. They'll be different depending on which level of or area of theology you come from. And I'm not wanting to get into a debate about the theology in this course. There is a subsequent course which will deal with these theological doctrines and how to understand them and connect with these theological doctrines in a more deeper way, in a more substantive way. But that particular one, I'll give you opportunity to do when you do that particular course. Instead, what we want to do now is to say, well, what are the broad themes of the New Testament? What are the broad themes that we can draw from the New Testament and understand and connect with, and the themes that we also need to know if we want to help us to interpret the New Testament properly? Now, as we've gone through the New Testament, you'd have seen that the writing of the New Testament happens over a significant period of time, at least 50 years. Over that 50 years, we also have a very different environment in which that's happening. For some of the letters, they're written within a Jewish environment to Jewish people and to a predominantly Jewish church. But as we see later on, all the later writings, things like, for example, even Paul's later writings like Timothy and Titus, not to mention John's writings of Revelation and even his letters, and even the letters then of Peter as well, and Hebrews and James, we see that there's a contextual change. And so finding or trying to find the themes that run through the whole New Testament is very tricky. It's a very difficult thing to do because there are so many different themes and so many different perspectives. Many of them are directed more by virtue of their context than by virtue of trying to maintain the integrity of a particular theme all the way through. As opposed to, for example, the Tanakh. Whereas the Tanakh is compiled together during the period of the exile. And so therefore it's during the period of the exile that most of the Torah and in fact significant parts of the former prophets are put together. What we realize is that the Tanakh then is able to maintain thematic connections or theme connections all the way through a lot of the Tanakh. That same thing is not true for the New Testament. The New Testament often was written in isolation, each book. That the books are written in isolation rather than compiled together by some editor who puts them together and makes them all uniform and connect with each other. In a sense, what we need to see is that the New Testament is much more isolated books and therefore having much more connections into themselves and therefore the themes within those books than having one central theme across all the books. So it's that kind of thing that we need to come to terms with when we read the New Testament. That it is very hard to grapple with a particular theme of the New Testament. Even Jesus and who Jesus is actually is reflected very differently depending on which book you're reading. So if you're reading the Synoptic Gospels, as we've said, you've got Jesus who's the man. If you're reading John, you've got Jesus who is God. If you've got Paul, you've got the resurrected Jesus. If you've got Hebrews, you've got the Jewish high priest. In each of those, you can see that there's a significant amount of isolation in interpretation. That instead of interpreting all of them using the same brush, the same tool, we really need to use different tools of interpretation. So these are the problems with key themes. And so that's why the themes that I've chosen for this module are themes that we can use across the board and have connection across the board with the whole New Testament. Come and join me as we go through these key themes of the New Testament.